Social justice, the current legislative agenda. My name is Steve Schneich. I'm the director of the Life Cycle Institute here at the Catholic University of America, along with University Archons and the Center for American Catholic Studies and the American Catholic History Research Center. The Life Cycle Institute is one of the co-sponsors of today's panel and also co-sponsor of the Catholic Social Justice series of talks, of which this is part. I'm also coincidentally a political scientist by training and chair of the politics department here at Catholic University. So today's focus on the legislative agenda has my full attention. Let me start with a bit of a story. My wife, Patricia's maiden name was McGee, good Irish stock, whose ancestors seem to have been part of the infamous Molly Maguires back in the last century. A few years ago, following the death of her father, the McGady family Bible passed to us. As usual, it's full of mass cards and baptism and confirmation records and so on and so forth, going back nearly a century. I mention this because, unlike a lot of contemporary Bibles, I noticed recently that this one has the words of Jesus in red letters in the New Testament. So when Christ says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's," that sentence is in red. For you Protestants in the crowd, that use of red type, of course, is pretty common in your printings. I was doing a panel last fall with Jim Wallis, author of God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. Wallis argued there that evangelicals and other Christians need to return to being what he called red-letter Christians. That Christians are called to participate in politics and to advocate for public policies, but that such participation should be based on what Christ actually says in the Gospels, on the red letters. We all know what the red words say. Christ tells us to love our enemies, to visit the imprisoned, to serve the poor, to feed the hungry, to welcome the strangers among us, to clothe the needy, and so forth. And that will be judged by how well we have treated those least among us. Jim Wallis's point last fall is one I think that you can all appreciate. It's aimed precisely at those evangelicals and others for whom religion in the public square is all about stem cells, abortion, gay marriage, and so forth, none of which figure prominently in red letters. I'm not sure that I agree simply with Wallis. Indeed, I'm convinced that abortion remains the most important public policy issue facing American Christians. But I'm utterly persuaded that we must return to the full fabric of the red letters of the Gospels. That's what I understand, indeed, as Catholic social justice. With that, let me turn to introduce today's panelists. Let me note first that Catherine Pickerton is not with us as yet. Our first panelist will be John Carr. John Carr serves as Secretary of the Department of Social Development and World Peace at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. In this role, he assists bishops in sharing Catholic social teaching, advocating on major issues of justice and peace, and building the Catholic community's capacity to act on its social mission. John coordinates the Catholic bishops' policy development and advocacy efforts on a wide range of national and global issues, including red letter sorts of things: poverty, hunger, health care, human rights, religious freedom, debt, development and trade, war and peace. He has assisted the U.S. bishops in developing a number of significant statements, including Communities of Salt and Light, Sharing Catholic Teaching, Call to Global Solidarity, Everyday Christianity, and Faithful Citizenship. For 3 decades, John has been a leader in Catholic social ministry, serving at the USCCB as Cardinal Hickey's Secretary of Social Concerns here in the Archdiocese of Washington. Outside the Church, John has served as Executive Director of the White House Conference on Family and as Director of the National Committee for Full Employment. He currently serves on the board of Bread for the World and National Religious Partnership for the Environment, the Catholic Health Association, and the Law School of the University of St. Thomas. He's a regular presenter at Preaching the Just Word retreats offers to priests around the country. I should mention, too, he has recently received the Vision Award from Catholic Charities USA. He was also given the Monsignor John Egan Award by the National Pastoral Life Center and was named a Hunger Hero by Bread for the World. And John will be our first speaker.
Thank you very much. 15 minutes ago, I was seated at my desk across the street talking about third world debt, and got a phone call, and I was informed that this panel began at 4, not 4:30. So I appreciate your patience. I'm really happy to be here, but I'm a little anxious. Candy has heard me tell the story 1,000 times, but it's still a good story. How would you like to be Secretary of Social Development and World Peace for the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference? I tell the story. Being at the bishops' meeting, we had these ridiculously large name cards, and it says my title, and obviously I work for the bishops. And a couple got on an elevator with me, and they were looking at me sort of strangely. And finally, the guy said, "You're not a bishop." I don't know whether it was my wedding ring or the way I was dressed that gave me away. I said, "No, I'm not a bishop. I work for the bishops." And I could see he was reading the rest of the name card. And he turned to his wife and said, "He's in charge of social development and world peace." And she seemed a little underwhelmed by this. She said, "You need to do a better job." Clearly, we need to do a better job, continue to do that. It's a great thing to be part of a discussion like this and a series like this. It's been 25 years since the Economic Pastoral, which I think is the inspiration for this series. And a lot of things have changed. I have changed. I used to have more hair. I used to be a different color. I forgot that my resume says I'm a hunger hero. It must be because of what I eat, not because of what I pass out. I was a different shape then. I actually was working for the Archdiocese at the time, deeply involved in efforts to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless. So I've changed. Such Catherine, when she's here, she has been doing the same thing she always has done, which is speaking and standing up for the poor. She's one of the great women of Washington. Our country has changed. The country has changed a lot. We've been through different presidents, recession, growth. Now we've been through 9/11, we're in 2 wars. But in terms of economic life, I think the one factor that has changed most dramatically that would affect how the bishops might write the economic letter for we're written today, it would be the advance of globalization. This world is shrinking. I always say the Catholic Church was global before globalization was cool. But the rest of the world has really caught up to us in that it is a shrinking world. And what happens, across the border is what used to be what happened in another neighborhood in terms of wages and prices and pressures. My sense is that in this town, at least, people see globalization as either the source of all the problems or the solution to all the problems. And my own view is to be a little skeptical of both of those. What the red letter vision of globalization suggests is that we ought to look at that process from the bottom up. How does it touch not the rich and famous, not the powerful, but the weak and the vulnerable? And the other things that have changed, a lot has changed in our church. I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is we're very much a church under challenge as a result of the sexual abuse scandals and the costs of that. The costs are personal, the costs are pastoral, the costs are moral and spiritual, but they're also financial. And I work at the Bishops' Conference, and we're in the process of getting smaller as the 5th diocese goes bankrupt in this country. We don't do the same kind of pastoral letters as we did 25 years ago. I have here a copy of the 10th anniversary reflection of the pastoral letter, and frankly, nobody paid much attention. One of the things people have learned, at least our political adversaries on some of this, is they do not attack the work of the bishops in the same way. Part of the reason the economic letter got so much attention in the secular media was that the current administration, in this case the Reagan administration, very worried about it and attacked it. The chief of staff at the White House said the bishops were out of their league and out of their depth and going in the wrong directions. There are efforts that the conference has undertaken, and I brought some copies or some summaries of that. And one I'm going to refer to is called A Place at the Table, which is a reflection on poverty at home and abroad and what our faith calls us to be a part of. And the ongoing work of Catholic Charities, which Candy serves so well, of Network, that Sister serves so well, of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and so many other entities within our church. These days, I would say that the way the conference is trying to pursue this agenda is not by producing more words, but by doing more work, by trying to not just create challenging statements, but actually to create some change in the policies in our government. That's changed. What has not changed is our mission. And this would be the red letter Bible passage that I would find. This was Jesus' message as he began his public life in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. And I think this is the mission of the church in public life today. The words are familiar to us. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Good news to the poor, keep liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and to set the downtrodden free. How do we bring good news to the poor in the richest nation on earth? Set free the captives that are enslaved by discrimination or addiction or their immigration status. How do we set the downtrodden free? One thing that has not changed is we're still the richest nation on earth, and we still have pervasive poverty. This is a quote from the pastoral letter. So many people are poor, and our nation as rich as ours is a social and moral scandal that we cannot ignore. The number of poor people are growing, the gaps are growing. We were promised a dialogue and maybe some action about poverty in the aftermath of Katrina. That came and went with precious little discussion and almost no action. What was a natural disaster has now become a man-made catastrophe, if you've been to New Orleans lately. I find the discussion of poverty in our country often polarized and paralyzed by ideological false choices in my mind, personal responsibility versus social responsibility. And with some exceptions, John Edwards might be an exception, most of the politics that is poll-driven and focus group-driven avoids poverty. It's about the forgotten middle class. It's about more powerful interests. And the thing I could not have predicted 25 years ago, and on one way I'm thrilled by, is global poverty has become a grassroots issue. And with that, we made a difference on debt and development disease. I think Catherine's going to talk about something. We have a lot more to do, but we have parishes and schools and colleges and universities working on debt and development in ways, frankly, I could not have imagined. And that's the good news. The bad news is poverty in the United States. There are no celebrities visiting Anacostia. There's pressure with little focus in the Congress on the poor people here in our country. This is still the most powerful, productive economy on earth. And it's pushing us forward in some ways, and it's pulling us apart in other ways. Some people are moving ahead. A lot of other people are left behind. You may step over them on your way over here. A lot of us are in the middle squeezed. I filled out my FAFSA. I have a daughter at Loyola, and was 2 weeks late. But I make a wonderful living for a church bureaucrat, but I don't know how to pay tuition and save for retirement. And then we all know there's a fourth economy, really the shadow economy, with people without the right status or the right papers are ripe for exploitation, even as they contribute to our economic life. With this mission, with this context, comes a message. And that message is the red letter message, the Word of God, the teaching of the church. And it doesn't fit the ideological, political categories of our day. We're not the Democratic Party of prayer. We're not the religious caucus of the Republican Party. And in fact, we have an old message expressed in a new way. And that message is God is love. This is the title of Benedict XVI's new encyclical. It was also what the Apostle John said to us 2,000 years ago. And frankly, I was surprised by the topic. There are experts in the room who followed this much more than I do. Most of us didn't think the focus of the Holy Father's first teaching would be on love. I flabbergasted that you could summarize Benedict's first encyclical as, in the words of an old Beatles song, all you need is love. John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Benedict. It just didn't seem to fit to me. But I want to put up on the screen two sentences. Love of God and love of neighbor have become one. In the least of the brethren we find Jesus himself, and in Jesus we find God. Lord, which is the greater commandment? Wrong question. Love of God and love of neighbor have become one. If you're looking for God, you'll find him in Jesus, and if you're looking for Jesus, you'll find him in the poor. And it goes on to say, love for widows and orphans, prisoners, and the sick and needy of every kind is as essential to the church as the ministry of the sacraments and preaching the gospel. Three things make the church: proclaiming the gospel, celebrating the sacraments, and caring for those in need. And as our topic about carrying these values into the public arena, the Pope says charity must animate the entire lives of the lay faithful, and therefore also their political activity, lived as social charity. We used to debate what's more important, charity and justice. They are linked. What Sister is going to talk about, what Candy is going to talk about, is social charity, is the work of the church and charity at work. This tradition offers not highest platitudes. With all due respect to our evangelical sisters and brothers, this is a lot more complicated than what would Jesus do. It offers hard questions, not easy answers. And one of the things I brought along, and if I had been on time, you'd have it in your hands, is a summary, a card. When the Economic Fast Bill was written, one of the bishops stood up and he said, I really support everything that's in this, but it's 200 pages long and there's 150 footnotes. I don't quite know what to do with it. He said, if we could find a way to fit these ideas on a holy card, we really have something. So what you have here, and I hope you will pick one out, is sort of the holy card version of a century and 15 years of Catholic social teaching. I'm not going to go through all those, but the central point is economic life is part of moral life. And the choices we make as owners and workers, and as citizens who have a voice in economic policy, have moral dimensions and human consequences. So in light of that framework, in light of those ideas, what's the legacy of the economic pastorate? And I would suggest the legacy is the work to act on its principles, to take its values and put them to work in our economic life and in our public life. The pastoral said the way society responds to the needs of the poor through its public policies is the litmus test of its justice or injustice. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We bring ideas to that discussion. I think in many ways the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word and. Human life and dignity. Human rights and responsibility. Solidarity and subsidiarity. Charity and justice. And the ultimate end, which is this notion of the common good, that we are in this together and we're only as strong as the weakest member. We also bring experience. Think of the work of Catholic Charities. Tonight in the snow, there are hundreds, thousands of people who will find a place out of the wind and snow because of the work of Charities in this church. So we have a lot to have. It's not just what we know, it's what we do that counts. And we have structures and leaders and people and institutions like this university. What I also want to share with you and brought along is a way of thinking about our work for poverty. It's called a place at the table. And what it suggests is the image of a table. A table is where I'll go home and eat for dinner with what's left of my family. And some people we have to acknowledge have no table, have no food to put on the table. A table is where we make decisions. At the Congress, Finance Committee, at the UN, in Washington. Some people have no voice at that table. And a table is where those of us who are Catholic gather for worship and are sent forth from that table to make sure everybody has a place at the table of life. The other way of thinking about this table is it really reflects the way our tradition suggests that we think about overcoming poverty. Think about a table with 4 legs. One leg is what individuals and families ought to do, whether they live in Anacostia or Potomac or Bangladesh. The choices they make, how they raise their children. A second leg of that table is what community groups like Catholic Charities, groups like community organizations, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development supports, that support families, that work against the injustice in our society. A third leg of that table, in my mind, in the Church's tradition, is what the market ought to do. And I frankly think they too often get a pass in the poverty debate. A lot of emphasis on what the market can do, should do, ought to be organized. The market ought to assure people that when you work, you can raise your family in dignity. So decent jobs and wages and working conditions. And work ought to be an escape from poverty, not another form of poverty. And then the other fourth leg, the indispensable leg, essential, as they all are, is the work of government that steps up when those other institutions fail. It works against discrimination and injustice. It provides a safety net. The problem with Washington, the problem with Capitol Hill, when I'm up there, is everybody falls in love with one leg of the table. You know, the market will solve all our problems. Our families are the answer to everything. Our faith-based institutions will do it all. That's not our tradition. That's not the way that we fashion our agenda. Our agenda says the poor ought to come first. So 10 days ago, 600 leaders from across the country went to Capitol Hill and made the case that the budget ought to be judged on how it touches the least and the lost and left out. The poor are not left behind simply in New Orleans or on the Gulf Coast. They're left behind in the halls of Congress. That's why we're working for an increase in the minimum wage. That's why we're working today for health care for children. That's why we're working to reform a broken immigration system. Imagine what this city would be like if we did not have the work, the contributions of the immigrants in our midst. That's why we're working, believe it or not, for a fair farm bill. I'm a city boy. I never thought I'd work on a farm bill. But when we work on the farm bill, we work on nutrition for hungry children. We work on poverty in rural communities. We ensure that farmers, small farmers, can make a living, and farm workers' children don't get sick, and that farmers in Africa have a fair shot at our markets and hungry people around the world. We went to the Hill working for resources for HIV/AIDS and malaria, insisting that the lives of those children are precious to us as well. Our conference, and I think in continuing the legacy, working with Network, working with charities, working with others, is conducting campaigns for health care against the death penalty, to fix our broken immigration system, and to reduce global poverty. It can make a difference. Maybe in the question period we can talk a little bit about how our churches made a difference. Quietly, it will not be in the newspapers. It will not be the evening news. But we, by working together, from the highest levels to the lowest levels, have made a difference. And there are children going to school in Africa because of the work of our community of faith. There are people being served and people have health care, children in this country, because of the work of our community of faith. In the end, I think we have to remind ourselves as we move forward on this agenda that these ideas are about individual lives. They are not just a set of moral principles. They are about people, their lives and their dignity. I gave a talk in upstate New York in an astute group of Catholic business leaders. And I thought the talk went pretty well. I had sort of outlined some of these same things at a business card. And at the very end, I sat down, and most people seemed very gracious, kind. One guy was very upset. And unfortunately, it was the guy I had to see next to, and was the president of the group. And I said, "You seem unhappy." He said, what's the problem? He said, you don't want to know. And by then I didn't want to know. But I said, no, what's it? He said, I'm tired of all this talk about the poor, the unborn, immigrants, solidarity. What about me? What about people like me? Pay the bills, work hard. Is there anything in those encyclicals for me? And I talked about Matthew 25. I talked about John Paul II. I got to know it. I said, what do you do for a living? He said, I'm a lawyer. I work hard. More people ought to work as hard as I do. I said, well, when you're working that hard, do you ever run across the person who cleans your office? He said, what do you mean? I said, somebody vacuums the rug, somebody dusts the desk, somebody scrubs the toilet. He said, yeah. I said, tell me about that person. He said, well, it's a woman, an immigrant, she's been around a while. I said, what do you pay that person? He said, well, we don't really pay her. We hire a firm and they hire her. I said, come on, what do you pay? He says, probably minimum wage. I said, does your firm have a help fund? He says, yes, a good one. It covers families. I said, does the woman who cleans your office, can she take her kids to the doctor when they get sick? Is she a part of your plan? He said, I don't think so. I said, what are you getting at? I said, what I'm getting at is this is not about John Kerry or George Bush. This is not about liberal or conservative. This is about whether the woman who cleans your office, whether she and her husband can raise their kids in dignity and can take their kids to the doctor when they get sick. And he said, why didn't you say so? Part of this university, part of this panel, part of this series ought to be about making sure no one can say, why didn't you say so? Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, John. Our second speaker is Candy S. Hill, who serves as Senior Vice President for Social Policy and Government Affairs at Catholic Charities USA, which is the membership association of one of the nation's largest social service networks. She's responsible for directing the organization's federal advocacy efforts, representing Catholic Charities USA on Capitol Hill and with the administration, and serving as the organization's spokesperson on social policy. She's also an adjunct professor here at the Catholic University's Columbus School of Law. She's also a member of the Gender Committee of North America, and most recently was invited by the Permanent Observer of the Holy See to the United Nations at a side event on violence against women, where she spoke on domestic violence, service and policy. Ms. Hill is a native of Michigan, joined Catholic Charities USA after 5 years as president and CEO of Catholic Charities of Monroe County in Michigan. From 1999 to 2001, Hill was the diocesan director of agencies and institutions for the Archdiocese of Detroit, serving as a liaison between the Archdiocese and its 8 social service agencies and 33 affiliates. Prior to joining the Archdiocese, she worked for more than 25 years for the state of Michigan's Department of Human Services, formerly the Family Independence Agency. I should mention, by the way, the Catholic Charities USA's members, more than 1,300 local agencies and institutions nationwide, serve nearly 7 million people a year, regardless of religious, social, or economic backgrounds. Candy Hill.
Hopefully I can find my presentation on here. That's the worst part of the presentation for me. First of all, I'm really privileged to be here today, and I'm a neophyte among this panel. I'm still hoping that I'm on the honeymoon stage of my time here in Washington, D.C., having not reached 24 months yet. I have to tell you that this has been an incredible journey in the last few months because while I was excited about coming here and trying to make a difference on the national scene, I'm extremely disappointed in what I found in Washington, D.C. The poor are not in anybody's radar screen on Capitol Hill. I think the responsibility of the church, both Catholic Charities and my colleagues here, is that we try every day to make sure that the people who are legislating and who are sitting in the White House think about the least among us. I have to tell you that I think that's an extremely large challenge right now, something that we continue to do, but a difficult barrier to get through. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very serious problem. 37 million people in this country every day are poor. In the greatest country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, we have not figured out how to serve the least among us. And there are people that go to sleep in this town perfectly satisfied with that number. Nobody's losing sleep about the programs that we're not able to provide. Nobody's losing sleep about the poor children. Nobody's losing sleep because a senior citizen doesn't have enough to eat. But you and I and our collective voice could make a difference. And how is that possible? In this great country, we know that the will of the people can either put people in office or they can take them out. We know some of the greatest movements that changed legislation in this country came from the people. On my way here today, I was hearing someone from the civil rights movement talk about parity of black people in terms of their income level compared to whites. When the civil rights movement started 50 years ago, they made 57% of what a white person does, and 50 years later, they make 61%. It took 50 years to move the needle 4 percentage points. We've got a lot of work to do. And so, as a result of this experience and the experience of running a Catholic Charities agency and being part of a response system in a church that has this great thing called Catholic social teaching that I didn't discover until, in fact, I actually worked for the church. I was a Catholic for years, but nobody told me about it. It's the best kept secret in the world. And having known that I was actually living out the gospel in this great thing called Catholic social teaching, it's a great message to take to people on Capitol Hill. And so that's what Catholic Charities USA is doing. We have put together a continuing dialogue, if you would, of the pastoral from 25 years ago. You will see in some of the documents that we are producing quotations from the bishop's pastoral. It's really sad that I could look in this book and almost on every 5 pages find a quotation that would apply 25 years later. Not in a positive way, but in a way that the bishops talked about, this should change, and it should have changed 25 years ago. So I'm anxious to hear from you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our campaign. I left some materials on your seat. I have brochures and some cards, and would really like the opportunity to have a continuing dialogue with you about this. First of all, for those of you who don't know, Catholic Charities has a 275-year history in the United States of providing services. It's ironic that our roots go back to the 9th Ward in New Orleans, given the Katrina disaster with the Ursuline Sisters. And our founding of our official Catholic Charities USA program was here on the campus of this university in 1910. And so in a few years, we're going to celebrate 100 years of service, and we've grown to be this phenomenal organization that served the poor. I don't think it's a positive thing that I can stand before you and say that we've grown to a large organization to serve the poor. Because if we were really doing what we needed to do in this country, we wouldn't have had to grow to 1,300 agencies who serve poor people in this country every day. And as was mentioned in my introduction, we have 173 Catholic dioceses who have 1,500 branches who serve 7.4 million people every year. A phenomenal amount of work that's done, something we're very proud of. but also a challenge, because it isn't just about providing a bed and providing a meal and providing transitional housing and providing mental health services. We also have to change society so that these services are not necessary for people any longer. So we exercise leadership towards, we're a membership organization, by the way, so these are 173 independent dioceses who actually report to a bishop. So we're much like a trade association in that we provide training and guidance and advocacy, but we do not have a direct line of authority to tell an individual agency how they're going to operate or what they're going to provide in their community. So our mission is to provide service, advocacy, and community. As part of that original charter here at this school, it was determined that we were going to be the attorney for the poor. Now, some people have said to me, I don't know if attorney is a good word to use for the work that you do. I'm sure that doesn't bring up exactly positive thoughts from people. Wouldn't advocate be better? Maybe, but I think attorney at the time that we signed this charter meant somebody who was strong in voice, who could speak on behalf of others that couldn't have a voice. And so I think that's the role that we've been asked to have. Certainly Catholic social teaching guides our work. You'll notice in your packets, those of you who were able to get packets, we have a legislative agenda. It's grounded in Catholic social teaching as it talks about health, hunger, housing, and family economic security. Mirroring what John Carr said in his remarks, we work together on the same issues, trying to have a Catholic voice on behalf of those we serve. One of the unique characteristics for us is that we provide service to people who are affected by these policies. So part of this campaign that I'm going to talk to you about is actually helping people be empowered to tell their own story. Nothing is more effective than having a person who's living this experience talk about it. Because I'm a neophyte here, I can get away with saying this, but I think, people on Capitol Hill can find people like us to talk on behalf of poor people on a regular basis. But they don't necessarily have in their offices a poor person who's being affected by the very policies that they're enacting. And it's much harder for that person at night to think about some of the actions or inactions they're taking when they've actually met the people that are being served. And so one of the things about this campaign is to bring those people to Washington to have an impact on what's happening here. And also when they're back visiting their home districts, to actually have them engage with Catholic Charities, to see on the ground the work that's being done, but also the policies that are affecting the very people that they represent here in Washington, D.C. So what about poverty in America? It's a national disgrace. John did a slide on what has changed and what hasn't changed, so I'm not going to go back through that because I thoroughly agree with him, and I could go through this book as I said, and I picked out passages along the way that said, we need to do something about the minimum wage 25 years ago. We need to do something about health care 25 years ago. We're still lobbying on the same issues as I stand here today. What's changed? Well, we got welfare reform. So we did away with AFDC, but now we have this welfare to work program. More people are working, and that's good. Personal responsibility is part of that equation. But the irony of all that is more people are on food stamps and more people are on Medicaid than ever before in the history of this country. They are now the working poor. Many people are going to bed at night hungry. Wouldn't it be great that if there was a sign outside of every town and village in the city of the United States that says, "No hunger here. This is a hunger-free." So 12.6% of the American population is in poverty. And I want to say that Catholic Campaign for Human Development, was mentioned in John's remarks. Catholic Campaign for Human Development over the last 25 years has really tried to put a face on poverty in this country. They've done an excellent job of educating the public. They've also done a very good job of empowering people in various communities across this country. I would encourage you to go to their website because they have some really good educational materials. It's povertyusa.org. Excellent. When I see the federal poverty level is $20,000 for a family, every time I see that, I think of their website where they actually take you through with a family the expenses of an average family and what's left at the end of the day when you pay rent and food and utilities and health care and child care for that family. So I'd encourage you to go there. People of color still experience higher poverty rates. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Catholic Charities is doing this year to talk more about how race impacts poverty and how poverty impacts race. Most of the poor work. Nearly 2 out of 3 families in this country work. Many of the people that come to our emergency services programs across the country have 2 and 3 jobs and still can't pay the rent, utilities, and provide food. We have seen a 14% increase over the last year in the number of people coming to Catholic Charities agencies for basic needs. Poverty is a moral and social wound in our nation. It threatens the health and economic well-being of our families. It is a question of human dignity. So in 2006, in the wake of Katrina, the Board of Trustees of Catholic Charities USA said, we saw those faces. We saw the extreme poverty. We saw the national dialogue, and a few days later, we saw nothing happen, especially here in Washington, D.C. And so the Board of Trustees says we have to make a statement about this. We have to do something about it. We have to write about our experience with it. We have to challenge others to walk with us. We have to do something about this outrageous sin, poverty. And so this paper, Poverty in America, Threat to the Common Good, was actually written. And I want to mention one of the writers of this paper was actually one of the original writers of the pastoral. And so you'll see a continuing theme of the pastoral in this paper about poverty in America that was released in 2006. Everybody got excited about this poverty paper, but one of the things that people got unexcited about is it's another 25-page, 35-page document. Shelf life, 20 years, 25 years. What are we going to do with this paper? It's a great paper, and everybody got excited about it. We convened 600 people around it. And the challenge that came back to us from our membership was, you have to do something else, folks, this time. And so what was born out of that is a campaign to reduce poverty in America by 50% by the year 2020. So this seizes the opportunity for a bold agenda, and it gives us an opportunity. I thought for sure John was going to talk about how in the last election, I stole this line from him, so I'm just going to use it, is that we didn't hear anybody talk about poor people in the 2006 election. Nobody talked about what's happening to the poor, how are they doing, what kinds of programs are candidates going to put forth on their platform. And so it's a goal of this campaign to have that discussion with people who are running for public office in this country, whether it's for the White House or for on Capitol Hill or the State House or it's your local city council. We want you to talk about what you're going to do about poverty in this country. So how are we going to attack the problem? Public policy, calling for change, public awareness, spreading the good news, agency action, client engagement, and calling all people, including all of you in this room, to join us in this campaign. So how can you get involved? You can go to the Catholic Charities USA website, and you can endorse the campaign online. You can get involved in the 20 things that you can do about poverty in this country, which is also available on our website. You can get involved in service and convening of groups around the issue of poverty, and you can become the will of the people that creates a movement to see that poverty is cut by 50% by the year 2020, and sooner if we all get on the same page, I think, at one time. We're going to partner with individuals, government, and organizations. Last night I was at a dinner. I ran into my old boss. Not that he recognized me, but it was a few years since I had last seen him. He was a little more rotund, and so was I. A little rare. But I used to work for Governor John Engler in Michigan, and he's now here as the head of the National Manufacturers Association. And John Engler is a Catholic, and he cares a lot about early childhood development. And he really thinks that the key to our success is by growing the farm team, our children, for the next generation. And he thinks we're doing a pretty lousy job of it. And so I spent an evening with him, and I'm looking forward to further dialogue. But it's, in the day that I worked for him in government, he was pushing welfare reform, and I was pushing back, saying no, because this is going to hurt people. And yet, at this point in our careers, we came together and we actually share something in common. Yeah, it is about helping our kids. about investing in the future of America. So the 3 prongs of the campaign are this: leadership, partnership, and accountability. Continuing to lead from our history, asking others to help us take the lead, partnering with government and other organizations, and certainly with our Catholic brothers and sisters. Accountability, holding ourselves first accountable for the kinds of services that we provide. Having enough guts to stand up and say when there's a lousy program that comes from Washington that's funded to help poor people, to say this is a really lousy program, it's not helping poor people, and you need to change it. It also means looking at government at all levels and our leaders and saying, every time we make a bad decision, you're going to hear from Catholic Charities USA. And I think we've kind of held to that, at least for the short term. President's State of the Union, he didn't talk about Katrina, he didn't talk about the Gulf Coast recovery, and he didn't talk about poor people in this country. He talked about poor people in other countries, but he didn't talk about domestic poverty. And so we wrote a letter to him and we said, we're very disappointed in you because we said we're going to hold you accountable. And then on the heels of the State of the Union came the budget. There wasn't anything that I could tell you about the budget that Catholic Charities USA likes. I mean, there was no saving grace in the budget for us. I mean, when you talk about health care, you talk about hunger, you talk about housing, and you talk about family economic security in this country, we didn't see a lot available for us to look at there. So we're very disappointed, and we're going to continue to work on messaging both to him and to Congress about what we think might fix it. I'm not going to go through all of this, but one of the things, the last bullet point about grassroots mobilization, we have 50,000 people that work for Catholic Charities. We serve 7.5 million people. That's a pretty loud voice when we got people to actually speak. And so right now what we're doing is mounting a massive grassroots mobilization campaign, engaging both our agencies, our boards of directors, and our staff, the clients that we serve, and the people that they collaborate with in their communities, to come together around the issue of poverty and what we can do to solve it. I'm not going to go through the whole entire legislative agenda, but you can actually go to our website or look in the packet and take a look at that. I mentioned all of we're going to message on these 4 points over and over again. Probably the one where John and our organization is currently working on is Medicaid, SCHIP, the reauthorization of that. We're working very hard on that. I think we've got a lot of people on board with us. I'm hoping that we're successful. But the bigger challenge for us is get SCHIP reauthorized, but get universal health care coverage for all kids in this country. This is some of the things that we're going to be doing in the future. We've done a Capitol Hill briefing. We're going to do another one in April. It's going to be on hunger. We're going to launch a fatherhood initiative in 2007, convening fathers who are living in poor economic conditions and who have been harmed, actually, by welfare reform with Father Larry, and a national conversation about fatherhood. We do an annual survey of our agencies. It's a pretty in-depth survey about what we see happening, and that's where the 14% increase in emergency services came from. And so we're going to begin to issue every November and Thanksgiving a report card on how the working poor in this country is doing. And the media can look forward to that coming out on an annual basis. We've been very pleased with the publicity that the campaign's gotten. But one thing about publicity when you're living in the moment, the real test is can you continue it? Can we actually build the momentum and the will to keep this campaign going and have success by 2020? So here's some nice pictures of the event that was mounted at Capitol Hill. What we want people to understand is that the room was full and overflowing. It's not always when Catholic Charities convenes an event at Capitol Hill that the room will be full and overflowing. And to my far left are some people that, if you could actually see this very clearly, are in this room. Sister Ann Pfeiffer Conrad came and she stood with us. Network was there. Catholics for the Common Good, Bishops' Conference, Catholic Health Association, St. Vincent de Paul, Ladies of Charity of the United States, CCHD, and the list goes on and on. So it was for us a very momentous occasion. And so here's some of the media coverage we've gotten. We like to look at this because one of the things that Catholics are not really good at doing is getting publicity for their acts of good work. It's ingrained in us that we shouldn't brag about when we're serving other people. But part of the problem with that is, and this is, part of the problem with that is when we were serving people along the Gulf Coast, there were others that were much better at getting publicity than we were, and so there are people in the church going, where's the church? And yet, the Catholic Church along the Gulf Coast was the best news for anything. You talk to anybody along, it was the best untold story of the church. We have no problem getting negative publicity. We're really very good at that. We have trouble talking about the good things that we do. So I'm going to try pushing this button. If it's not hypercating people. I'm moving the set and did don't know my talk with the computer fellows. Well. So we have launched this huge campaign. We're going to be messaging to people. We're asking people to endorse the campaign. If you endorse the campaign, you'll get all of the latest materials that are coming. We're interested in partnering with people about issues related to poverty in this country, looking at new models. One of the comments I had just before we started today is, and I'm sure that both of you are invited to these events. Since I'm a neophyte, I go to events that have to do with people who are interested in helping people with poverty almost every day. Some dinner, some lunch, some breakfast, some something. Each person has a particular interest in particular groups living in poverty. And they have tremendous resources, like I was at with early childhood people last night, and I've got people that worry about hunger in this nation. I've got worry about people who worry about health care. But the one thing that I notice most is that they don't ever come together. So each of them works their issue on Capitol Hill, and they put tremendous resources. But we're all talking about the same 37 million poor people in this country. If we could ever figure out how all of us here could have that conversation and could then move together, I think that this country would see a dramatic decrease. It is a very serious problem and one that we all need to be worried about. Thank you very much.
Our last speaker this afternoon is Sister Catherine Pinkerton. She's a member of the Congregation of St. Joseph, Cleveland. She served as a lobbyist for Network, the National Catholic Social Justice Lobby, for the past 22 years. Previously, she held positions in education administration, pastoral planning for the Diocese of Cleveland, and in leadership within her own congregation, in the National Assembly of Women Religious, and in the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Currently, she serves as the Vice President of the Church's Center for Theology and Public Policy and is on the Executive Committee of the Interfaith Resource Center for Faith and Public Policy. Sister Catherine.
I'm going to ask all of you to stand up for a minute. You've been sitting too long. And I'll probably turn on the computer with my paper because I'm not going to use the PowerPoint. Sit down. Just stretch. Stretch and sit down. The invitation to participate in the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Bishop's Pastoral on Economics resurrected a lot of images of sitting at Network with LaMonta Miller those years ago. She's the economic premier person in the world, and she went through that page by page by page, and we have lived that document over and over again. First, what is this entity called Network, the National Catholic Social Justice Lobby, referred to as by many on the Hill as the Nuns Lobby? While we may have been that earlier in our history, that is not as so as today. We were founded in 1971 by women religious in the United States in response to the Vatican Synod on Justice in the World. We are a registered federal lobby, the membership of which consists of women religious, but also men religious, progressive laity in parishes, social justice groups, campus organizations, and so forth. Therefore, we have paying members of about 12,000, but we have an outreach of 100,000. Network, at its inception in 1973, in response to the Vatican Synod, determined that its agenda would always focus on option for the poor. And so through the years, we have analyzed legislation through the lens of Catholic social teaching focusing on that wonderful document called the federal budget, which comes up all the time, which drives most legislation through both its entitlement and its discretionary programs, as well as taxes, federal funding, changes in policy. Consequently, we have dealt with all of the issues that were mentioned tonight: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the state children's health care program, the efforts at privatization of Medicare. We also addressed the coalitions working with universal access to affordable quality health care. I won't tell you how many times I've been down that road with the McDermott plan, the Wellstone-McDermott plan, with the START plan, with the Clinton plan, and with all kinds of ideas of spreading Medicare across the country so that we're all covered. On the agenda in this President's FY 2008 budget are the intolerable cuts in Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP. We continually address housing, and when we're mentioning about bringing people to the hill who are homeless, we one time, with all the housing organizations in the city, brought 2,100 homeless people to Congress. You should have seen them. They didn't know what hit them. And they told their stories, and I was in the room with three who were with the leadership, and they cried their eyes out at the end. I couldn't believe these fellows could cry. Among the international issues, we are currently engaged in efforts regarding economic rehabilitation in Iraq. We have presented to Congress a plan toward that, which I'll give you a copy of later. And we work on immigration. But the area I wish to address in particular, because of its implications for the future of the global economy, is that of international trade and investment, and its coherence with immigration and the farm bills, which Network will also address. In the economics pastoral, just before its conclusion, the bishop stated, "In order to pursue justice and peace on a global scale, we call for a U.S. international economic policy designed to empower people everywhere and enable them to continue to develop a sense of their own worth, improve the quality of their lives, and ensure that the benefits of economic growth are shared equitably." Then in their document commemorating the 10th anniversary of the economics pastoral, they raised a series of questions to be used as a lens in applying principles of Catholic social teaching as they perceive the unfolding future. How can U.S. workers and enterprises survive and thrive in a world where other nations compete by offering their workers subsistence wages and minimal benefits? Place that question in tandem with the latest debate on raising the minimum wage. How can a nation's economic power in the world, get this, we talked about the power of the economy in this country, how can a nation's economic power in the world be used to build a more just global economy? At first, I was puzzled by the simplicity of the questions until I came to the topic that they raised, cooperation at the international level. In our document's last chapter, they talked about the new American experience for the common good. Its relevance for today and for the future unfolding of the pastoral, which I think will go forward, is for me highly significant. The first paragraph elated me because it had a deep element of prophecy, which is so critical in Catholic social teaching. Quote, "If our country is to guide its international economic relationships by policies that serve human dignity and justice, we must expand our understanding of the moral responsibility of citizens to serve the common good of the entire planet." Got it? The entire planet. Cooperation is not limited to local, regional, or national level. Economic policy can no longer be governed by national goals alone. As I address the trade agenda, think of that. It can't be governed by national goals alone. The fact that the social question has become worldwide challenges us to broaden our horizons and enhance our collaboration and sense of solidarity on the global level. The unfinished business of the American experiment includes the formation of new international relationships, especially with developing countries, based on mutual respect, cooperation, and dedication to fundamental justice. We must remember that the document was written 10 years ago, and as most of us can say, the call to establish new international relationships in the evolving global reality daily intensifies, not only in the devastating wars in the Middle East, but almost as intensely through economic controls and mechanisms globally and nationally, which are favoring those who are rich and positioned and punish those who lack power and resources. We are fast becoming a nation and a global reality divided between the very rich and the very poor, as Kofi Annan tried to reiterate so frequently. Therefore, to reiterate, Network's global agenda for the 110th Congress has two aspects. First, the economic reconstruction of Iraq, and secondly, this nation's trade and investment agenda and its coherence with immigration. Let us move to the trade and investment agenda, with which I'm more heavily involved. Network works with a coalition, it's a wonderful coalition called the Interfaith Working Group on Trade and Investment, commonly called IWG. While all the members are devotees of free trade, believing that fair, balanced trade, respectful of the rights of all signatories, is a viable tool to development, we have nuanced the word free to fair. That is due to the history of the effects of U.S. trade agreements since NAFTA, the 1994 trade agreement made among the United States, Canada, and Mexico, forged by the Clinton administration. NAFTA becomes, in a real sense, proof of the coherence among trade, investment, and immigration. The Economic Policy Institute does best at going over NAFTA and its effects. In Mexico, real wages dropped 80%, and employment rose from 9 to 15%. Of all the salaried positions generated between the second quarter 2000 and the second quarter 2003, only 37 raised benefits, and 27 no benefits at all. Approximately 15 million Mexican farmers were forced to give up farming because of the massively subsidized U.S. agribusiness, which dumped cheap corn on the nation, which gave birth to maize. Today, there are riots in Mexico over the rising cost of tortillas. Due to the effects of CAFTA, most American workers, among them farmers, took low-wage work in maquilas or migrated to the United States. Yet it's often difficult to get Congress to focus on the coherence among trade, investment, and migration. In September 2006, EPI released this study, Still Not Working for North American Workers. NAFTA had promised Canada increased economic growth, income, and employment across all sectors and income groups. It promised closure of the long-standing productivity gap with the United States and the creation of a more diversified, efficient, and knowledge-based economy, one that would maintain the social model of the Government of Canada. Bruce Campbell, Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, recently noted that NAFTA caused only the growth of precarious unemployment, the undermining of their unions as a countervailing power to transnational capital, the erosion of the Canadian social state, and heightened economic dependence on the United States. Under NAFTA rules, Canada has lowered the government spending on individual and social programs, while real incomes have stagnated except at the top. He noted that at its core, NAFTA is about shifting the power of the economy from governments to corporations, from workers to corporations. Without a rebalancing of power in the continental economy, these problems will worsen. Since NAFTA, the Bush administration, with trade promotion authority granted by Congress, has well utilized the power to negotiate and expand trade agreements within the Americas and submit them to Congress for an up and down vote, with no debate allowed. Consequently, 6 countries of Central America and the Dominican Republic, under the Central America Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, with the exception of Costa Rica, are now locked into agreements with provisions comparable to those of NAFTA. It's NAFTA reborn. Costa Rica has not yet ratified that the agreement. However, a light doth shine. Because of the activity of trade groups, the hard-fought past midnight CAFTA vote in Congress became a sign that legislators were beginning to rethink trade agreements. Then this week, which was very interesting, 39 newly elected House Democrats, none of whom had been assigned to the Ways and Means Committee with jurisdiction over trade, demanded a meeting with the chair, Representative Charles Rangel, reminding him that opposition to the Bush trade policies were vital to their electoral successes. They were all elected on the trade issue. Network, as part of the Interfaith Working Group on Trade and Investment, a large coalition of faith groups with offices on Capitol Hill, was active during the CAFTA debate. In its initial formation, IWG at Interfaith developed a set of principles, and we worked for almost a year developing that set of principles. You have a copy. And at the end of that year, we submitted the set of principles to members of Congress. Interestingly, Marcy Kaptur of Ohio decided that it was such a very good examination of conscience for members of Congress as they looked at trade issues that she converted it into a congressional resolution. That's kind of rare when they take things that seriously. IWG, this faith group, analyzes each trade agreement from its principles and from the lived perspective of how those agreements affect the trading partners, especially people who are impoverished and who have little voice in the legislative process. Almost all IWG members, whether Catholics, among them Dominicans, Mercies, Columbians, Oblates, Maryknoll, Medical Mission, Notre Dame de Namur, Missionary Oblates, Conference of Major Superiors of Men, the Archdiocese of Washington, and Catholic Reading Services, or Methodists, Lutherans, Mennonites, Friends, Churches of Brethren, United Church of Christ, Commission of Reformed Judaism, Church World Services. All of them are missionary groups. They know what's going on in those countries. They have access to those countries. Nor have those in those countries been silent. They have objected even to the point of marches and work stoppages, but have been denied any place at the table in the design or the evolution of the political process which gives birth to these trade agreements. As for U.S. legislators, many in Congress who vote these agreements into law may never have met the poor farmers of Central America whose livelihood on small farms will be jeopardized by subsidized crops from America dumped on them. These people find they cannot compete with the low prices at which these crops can be sold, and thus farming becomes impossible as a source of livelihood. I remember as we interviewed labor leaders from Central America during the CAFTA debate, one Costa Rican farmer turned to me and he said, "You know what? If CAFTA goes through, I will have to give up my farm, and all the little farms around me will go out of existence," he said, "because we can't fight the cost of crops that you send into our country." And he said, "So what will happen? I will go to the city where there are no jobs, or I will go to the United States to try and find a job. And my wife, well, she'll have to find a job in the maquilas. But the important thing about the maquilas with women," he said, "is that they better be beautiful, they better be young, and they better get sterilized." Many in Congress who vote these agreements into law will never meet the workers, who earn far, far less than a livable wage and have few, if any, of the rights workers enjoy in this country, as U.S. corporations move into these countries to set up businesses that are more profitable due to cheap labor and less stringent production criteria. I was on my way back from California after having given a workshop on Catholic social teaching, and I was sitting in Phoenix eating a sandwich. This man sat down next to me and he said, "Where are you going?" And I thought, well, what's it to you? But anyway, I said, D.C. He said, "Oh, good." I said, "Why is it good?" He said, "Well, I'm going to Mexico." I said, "Fine." I kept eating my sandwich. He said, "You want to know why?" And I said, "No, but I'm sure you're going to tell me." He said, "You know, I'm the 5th generation owner of a furniture plant in the United States." It's the 5th generation. I got it. Nice. "Did you ever hear of NAFTA?" And I thought, "Oh, yes." "How do you know anything about it?" I said, "I worked against it in Congress." And I was so embarrassed, he stood up and said, "What the hell did you do that for?" I said, "Would you please be quiet?" So he sat down and he said, "NAFTA was a wonderful thing. It allowed me to take my plant and move it to Mexico. I was paying $15 an hour in the States. I'm paying less than $2 there. Plus that, I can put finishes on my furniture that I couldn't put on when I was in the States." I said, "Now we have a Clean Air Act." I said, "The air, does go around the globe." And he said, "I don't care. I'm making money hand over fist." Many in Congress will never meet the Mexican people who lost factory jobs, as corporations traded Mexico's $5 a day wages for China's $1 a day wages. Some 1.3 million campesinos lost their livelihoods and began migration to the States, as we in the legislative arena anguish over what to do about the provisions of a just immigration bill. Ever think about it? Why are they here? Many in Congress have never met people deprived of generic drugs, because U.S. pharmaceuticals maintain the right to withhold such drugs as part of the investment provisions in the agreement. So what do we face legislatively? Again, one of the key issues for this session of Congress will be the renewal of the President's Trade Promotion Authority, commonly dubbed Fast Track, which expires in July. As you undoubtedly know, Congress gave its constitutional authority over trade to President Bush, enabling him through the USTR to negotiate trade agreements with countries and then bring them back to Congress for an up or down vote. No debate, no amendments. Again, by granting the President this authority, Congress not only relinquishes its constitutional jurisdiction over commerce, but denies the electorate any voice in that whole process. Currently, the renewal of TPA is a major focus of trade groups, as our pending trade agreements already negotiated by the Bush administration. And I just want to talk about two of those. Among the current trade groups under consideration are those with Peru, Colombia, Panama, and Korea. These agreements contain the same provisions as CAFTA, place corporate profit over the welfare and dignity of people. They are decidedly focused on increasing the profits of the corporations by restricting the authority to ensure that trade and investment benefit a larger society. Workers must expect worse working conditions, more damaging natural resource exploitation. Small farmers will be displaced by competition with agribusiness giants, and the sick will experience the power of the pharmaceutical companies to limit access to generic drugs. To demonstrate the dire situation relative to impoverished and disengaged people, listen to the Korean and Peruvian agreements. The Peruvian trade agreement would undermine Peruvian sovereignty, place severe conditions on a nation with very little economic power. The agreement would promote the deregulation and privatization of essential services like water, education, healthcare. No more government provision. Give multinational corporations the right to sue the governments in secret tribunals for any policies made by the government, local government, which would infringe on their profits. Another result would be environmental degradation, as Peru would not be permitted to pass environmental laws without risking corporate suit due to profit-infringing laws. In the Korean agreement, 2 weeks ago, there were a lot of rallies around Capitol Hill. We're just a block from Capitol Hill. And I was very interested, so I went down to see what it was about. And one was the Washington Court Hotel. There was a meeting of people in the hotel doing policy around trade. And outside were the workers from Korea. This is an agreement being honored by the Korean government in no small measure as an instrument of political reconciliation with the United States, because we've had divisions with them over Korean reunification and the handling of the North Korean nuclear debacle. Anti-U.S. sentiment runs high in South Korea. Therefore, the protests of the farmers have been met with police raids of farmers and workers' organizations. But these Korean farmers were going to get ahead of the game, so they came to the United States. They were protesting the possible dumping on Korea of U.S. rice, the most subsidized crop in the world. Dr. Ki Woon Lee, chair of the Agricultural Economics Department of Sasban University, stated that the 140,000 Korean farmers would be without livelihoods post-FTA. And this in a situation where from 1995 to 2005, the U.S. rice industry received $10.5 billion in subsidies, 25% of which went to the upper 1% of the crop growers. The average U.S. rice farm is 397 acres compared to South Korea's average of 3.5 acres. Approximately 8,000 of America's 2 million farms grow rice, whereas in Korea, 787,000 farms, or 57%, cultivate rice. It's their only crop. Canada. Meanwhile, in January, Canada launched a dispute with the World Trade Organization over trade distorting agricultural subsidies of the United States, especially those directed to corn farmers. Previously in Brazil, the United States was challenged about the subsidies, which the depressed world finds hurtful, hurting especially cotton producers globally. Canada has challenged the United States to live up to its obligations when this 2007 Farm Bill is considered and reduce these subsidies. To summarize, what all too many in the electorate fail to realize is that the post-NAFTA trade agreements increasingly affect the autonomy of state and local governments whose nations are signatory to them, ourselves included. Policies such as prevailing wage laws, local procurement policy, and offshoring measures, food safety protection, land use, zoning laws can be challenged. Then the trade agreements are signed without any state or local initiative. Consequently, the present world trading system is in the hands of international economic groups. The convergence of an overwhelming desire for profits by multinational corporations is the pillar of the present market-oriented international world order, or I would say disorder. Those who want deep changes are faced with powerful opponents, governments, local economic groups, and consumers who benefit from the international system. In the Bishop's letter, economic justice is defined as universal participation in the economic life of the community. Thus, the economy of a community is just from the distributive point of view when it has established minimum levels of participation by all members in the life of the community. Three main groups which the pastoral raises up are the unemployed and those whose incomes fall beneath the government's official poverty line, and the disadvantaged members of developing nations. The bishops are critical of economic arrangements that effectively bar these groups from participating in economic activities and sharing its benefits. We stand with those pleas. We are a people steeped in faith traditions which seek to protect the rights of individuals as well as the good of society. Our actions flow from the principle of the common good, not only of humans, but of the planet. We see massive change being born of the ecological crisis, which concerns everyone as it attacks the very diversity of God's creation. We envision an economic system that transcends the current class system of market versus the state and becomes more communitarian in focus. We in the IWG have critiqued and lobbied on the current trade agreements being advanced by the administration. It's very interesting. When I went into lobby on the Korean one, this representative unnamed said to me, you know, I know all about how networks dance on domestic stuff. I didn't know about this trade stuff. And I said, could I step back from answering that question? And he said, what do you want to say? I said, you know, I don't think you people really think conceptually up here. And he said, what do you mean by that? I said, well, take any agreement, but take specifically a trade agreement. The first question you're going to ask is how it affects your district, how it affects the next vote for you. He sat back and he said, you're right. I said, but we're living in a global reality. We're living in a national reality. We're living in a global reality. Are we looking at how everyone is affected by this? Are we trying to make the best thing to affect the poor in our community? He said, with the gong went off for a vote. You know, those gongs for votes, I think they played them that way. Anyway, he turned to his chief, I thought this was the end of the conversation. He turned to his chief of staff and he said, how much time will I be away? And she said, probably 45 minutes an hour. He said, do you mind waiting? And we talked it out. I heard him give a talk the other day. It was kind of interesting. We're having a hearing. Now, I got to tell you about this because I want you to come to it. The IWG has decided we're going to try to get the conscience of Congress on this. So we are hosting, in conjunction with Marcy Chapter of Ohio and Representative Walter Jones from North Carolina, a Republican who is a staunch Catholic. It's an invitation to engage members of Congress and their staffs in rethinking current U.S. trade policy for the common good. Don't you like that title? Rethinking current U.S. trade policy for the common good. You're going to get copies of the invitations. We have invited people from other countries with whom we trade, as well as analysts from the United States, to critique the effects of current trade policies on our vulnerable trading partners. Hopefully, this will give impetus to the task of rethinking these agreements, not only in terms of economic equity and fairness, but also in terms of the global economy. Although Congress has begun to address trade agreements within the context of evolving globalization, it is yet to position globalization within the ecological crisis. As noted above, perhaps the growing awareness of the fragility of the planet will bring the human community to that level of consciousness that survival requires massive changes in the current global economic system. The competitiveness agenda must give way to a human rights agenda. I put it that way to avoid the obvious truth to a survival agenda. And thus, having addressed Network's collaborative global agenda for this Congress in the light of the economics pastoral, I wish to affirm my deep and abiding appreciation and pride for the course of Catholic social teaching that has empowered us to critique the human and political movements of past decades from the industrial age until now. The importance of that body of teaching to other faith groups is evident in every ecumenical community with which I have participated. And I pray, with abiding confidence, that the leaders of the Church may throw off the burden of their current weakness and again engage the leaders of this nation, as well as other communities of faith, in envisioning and embracing the postmodern cosmology of ecological, social, and spiritual co-creation so that a just global community may eventually evolve. Thank you.
Before we turn to questions, I want to recognize Tim Moffett has an announcement about next week.
Yes, I just wanted to, and Maria Mosenga can add to this, but we're going to have another session next week, part of the series of lectures on Catholic social justice. And it will be on the living wage movement, which Midland Railway, like Catholic Charities, was born at Catholic University. Father John Ryan, across the way, the kind of father of the minimum wage and the living wage in the early 20th century, and it's been reborn in recent years. And so we're going to have a workshop on that. That will be next week at 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, and it'll be in that across the hall. Everybody's welcome to come to that.
I think this might be a nice time to recognize Maria Mosenga, who's done all of the organization for tonight. I think we have time for a few questions. I'll sit down and let the panel talk.
There have been a couple of hearings. There's one hearing, I was very disappointed. It was so one-sided in its approach to it. It was called the Trade Agenda and Globalization, but we never got to globalization. I think that I can understand as a legislator that it's an overwhelming responsibility. But I think, too, that we, as a Catholic community, and I lay that on us because we've had such a rich history of the Catholic social tradition, I think as a Catholic community we have so much to offer Congress in terms of what is evolving in the whole global community and the poor community. We're all interrelated. The U.S. economy cannot sustain itself without a global economy. And we're not thinking that way yet. We are not really thinking that way. You hear most Congress people wanting to maintain the supremacy of the United States in the global economic agenda, rather than what are we doing to lift up the rest of the world. We talk about trade can do it, but not the kind of trade we're doing now. Remember that, that's what you're doing. It's, and you said with some Congress people they understand it, the captors of the world. Walter Jones, who says, the other night I was at a meeting with several of them. Walter Jones walked in and he said, I won't tell you the first thing he said, but anyway, the second thing he said was, how can we as a Christian nation, how can we who speak of God do what we do to other nations in trade agreements? Americans. I cannot abide it any longer.
Just to add to that, at the Bishops' Conference, we're sort of taking a page out of Catholic Charities book. Candy talks about the impact of people who experience this directly. So much of our work on trade has been working with the church in other parts of the world and helping them be heard by policymakers, not only in this country. They all, frankly, like coming to this country and explaining why choices being made here have impacts at home. But we are also, particularly through Catholic Relief Services, working to help them have a voice in their own policies, because they, in fact, are the pastors, are the teachers, are serving those in need. As Sister has suggested, trade is a lot about politics, a little bit about economics, and almost nothing about people at this point. And what we're trying to do is lift up the human dimensions and therefore the moral dimensions of this. So much of our work has been trying to not simply go ourselves and raise questions, but provide a way for members of Congress, leaders of the administration, to hear directly from those countries about the human and therefore the moral consequences of this.
I reiterate that. During the Catholic debate, most of the people whom we were able to bring up were from Central America, were bishops. And other groups brought them up as well, because they were the ones that could speak with the people. And they were the ones that could be most, bold in saying what the situation really was. Now, the other day we were lucky to get someone who had come from Colombia, who's a legislator from Colombia, who's coming up to speak against his own country and what they were doing. So it's when you look at the trade agreements and you go into them bit by bit, it's really very, the only word I can use is nauseating.
Just to add to that, one of the things, my role in these conversations is to remind them that things that are decided in those negotiations can't be undone in Washington. That very often when bishops and others come forward and think that our conference and their voice can change things that their government agreed to. And in fact, we're trying to encourage them, support them, help them be heard in the process. Frankly, while it's very complicated, as Sister has said, we have much more capacity to impact that debate in terms of how it affects workers, how it affects the environment, than people in the South. And so one of the responsibilities of being part of a universal church is to recognize that we belong to each other. And so the principal part of our responsibility as a bishops' conference is to help others be heard in our debate, but also in their own debates.
We had an interesting experience. It's not in Asia, but House Christie brought up a bishop and a deacon and the president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious in Japan to run the network. And they went to the network. What they wanted to do, they had not realized that you could go to Congress and talk to people. What they wanted to talk about was the movement of the United States to remilitarize Japan. And it was powerful because that's an agenda we hadn't even begun to think about. And they're coming next week to this ecumenical advocacy conference here in Washington, and they're hype on the hill because they found out that they could speak to. But as you say, we have to get them to talk to their own legislators. We have to open the doors for them.
Hi.
Well, the way you portray the voting on things like trade, debt, and so on, it's economic and political, but I don't have a religious dimension or even a moral dimension. And I wonder if the Catholic voice, and you as Catholic representatives, have anything at all to say in there. And where's your opening in their point of view?
Repeat again, where's the opening?
Into these issues which they see as being political and economic.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the debt issue. because it's an area we've made progress. And I'll tell a story. At the time of the millennium, the Jubilee, our bishops went to visit with the Holy Father, and he said, what are you going to do about the debt? What are you going to do about the Jubilee? And we had a medallion, and we had a prayer service, and we had lots of wonderful things. We were going to open doors and close doors. Terrific stuff. And the Pope, I won't imitate the accent, said, what about the debt? And he said, well, we're working on the debt. And this was the debt of foreign countries to our country and to multilateral institutions. And he said, you got to do more, and you have to focus on the human and the moral dimension of the debt, not the economic and the political. And so when you work for a bishops' conference and the Pope says, you need to do this, we tend to do this. And what happened is we were able to put together, Cardinal Carrick, now in Washington, took the lead in this. We put together, actually at Catholic University, the head of the International Monetary Fund, the head of the World Bank, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, some members of Congress, some finance ministers, some religious, some economists, some bankers, and we locked them together for 3 days. And we had a leader from the Vatican, and they all had their speech, and everybody had a well-rehearsed speech. The people from the poor countries said, our people are dying. They don't have health care. People from the rich countries said, there's terrible corruption. Both were true. And what happened in that session was we were able to find a way to say, if we could be assured, we being the leaders in the North, in the richer countries, that the money would actually, for debt relief, would actually go to housing and health care and education, that there would be some transparency, that ordinary people could have some impact on them, then we could work morally, freely, to increase debt relief. And out of that came the makings of an agreement, a deal. And actually, a gentleman in our office wrote the initial legislation. And at that time, the Clinton administration was opposed to us. The Congress had never even discussed it. My own view was if we were going to start forgiving debt, we ought to start with my visa bill. This seemed very complicated to me. And slowly over time, we were able to make the moral case that the people who were suffering from the debt had nothing to do with the money that was borrowed for airplanes or corruption and all that, and then been paid over and over and over again. And because that basic moral contract was made, that the debt relief would in fact go for education and housing and health care for poor people, we, working with Network, working with Bono, working with the Holy Father, working with everybody from the top to the bottom, were able to get first the administration and eventually the Congress. I remember one guy, I won't name him, Southerner. He said, I'm a Southern Baptist. He says, I don't believe in popes. But he says, we had given him some material from the Holy Father on debt relief in the Jubilee. And he said, I don't believe in popes. But he says, you have a pope who knows how to pope. And he had undergone something of a conversion on that. And it took years. But it was amazing. Less than a year ago, you had the United States and Great Britain fighting for who was going to do more to relieve the external debt of poor countries. And I was with, I'm dropping names, but it's the only name I can drop. I was with Bono 10 days ago. And he saw this brochure. If you've not seen it, he's Trade, Aid, Debt. He said, you were the people who accomplished the debt relief. He says, every pastor ought to stand up and say there are children going to school because of what the church did. And he said something that Candy said as well. He says, you are the worst communicators I've ever seen. He says, nobody knows that story. And now he says, let's work together on trade and aid. And, my daughters want to know why there was no pictures of me and Mom. But the point was, that was a case where we took an economic issue, focused on the human, which became the moral, and became a way that we took what we believe, what our experience is, our relationships across the world, and our access to power, frankly, and have made a huge difference. And while we have a long, long way to go, there are literally hundreds of thousands of children in Africa and Latin America that have a better life because of what we believe, who we knew, and how we put that to work. That's a success story. We have lots of things that aren't so successful. But when you wonder whether any of this makes any difference, it can in fact make a difference. But your point is essential. If we're just another interest group, we're just another, political voice. We have plenty of those in Washington. The church has to be the church. It has to be a community of faith, bringing everything it knows and has to that discussion.
It's interesting, right? We had the Catholic vote, we had a prayer session from all the groups, and we had Catholic bishop and imam and a whole array of ministers from different denominations. And everybody thought the Catholic vote would go largely in favor of the opposition. And the way it was thought out, there was a signal that Congress was beginning to think. But I still see those people standing around, all had a visual light, and all, even the Congress people that were there and praying. And the faith dimension in all of this is that you can't even walk into those offices without believing you're coming up a long faith tradition, and make it very clear to them that you're looking through a different lens. They look through it. And others will say, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say Catholic social teaching says. But you don't have to say Catholic social teaching says. Just reach for the heart of the person.
One thing I want to add, I know it's late. What we're doing is what happens all the time these days. I said in my little talk, I never thought that at a Catholic university we'd focus exclusively on international poverty. I mean, I thought that would be impossible to imagine. We have now gotten to the point, thanks to the work of a lot of people, that we really do understand that this is an issue of life and death. But the great irony is what Candy has been talking about. Here in our own country, our own city, are people who live without any real sense of dignity or hope. So I hope you, Catholic Charities providing remarkable leadership, go to that website, sign up for the campaign, get the materials. This is something, in my view, which brings the Catholic community together. What the Holy Father said in God is Love. What our Bishops' Conference, we're going to do fewer things, but one of the things we're going to do is focus on human life and human dignity. Catholic Charities is taking the lead in this campaign. There's an ecumenical initiative where other Christian groups are doing it. The Catholic Campaign for Human Development has been working on this for so long. This university, Monsignor John Ryan, Monsignor George Higgins, who great heroes in this movement. But I could not imagine that 10 years ago that we would spend so much time talking about trade, debt, and aid, and frankly so little time talking about the hungry and homeless in our own city. So go to that website, sign up, and get the materials.
I'm curious about what you see going forward in 2007 and 2008 as we already conferred the presidential primaries and presidential elections. What opportunities do you see to raise the agenda and the stories that you just told, which are so beautiful and so amazing, but do you see any opportunities to sort of influence the debates that are out there? And I was really curious to Candy with your comments about communications and needing to improve that and get our voice out there elsewhere.
I think that I'm going to speak from a Catholic Charities perspective. I think that on the ground we have been very, very busy doing two things that we all know we're supposed to be doing in our faith, and that is serving and educating people. We do a really great job on the ground collaborating. But we haven't done such a great job. We've allowed people that work here in Washington to kind of be our voice on Capitol Hill. And we have state Catholic conference directors that are associated with the Bishops' Conference. The Catholic Charities, who does service to people, actually touches lives every day, hasn't really done a very good job of using that information to advocate. And so I think we're going to really make a definite effort to work with everybody here at the table and other Catholic organizations, as well as our constituents at the grassroots level, to impact the debate. We're going to give our folks tools to be at town hall meetings. We're going to let our members know where their representatives who are running and candidates are running are going to be at. And we're going to put forth an agenda that we want people to answer to that's steeped in Catholic social teaching, and it makes people respond to the human dignity of the person from all aspects. And I think we can't let people who serve not talk about the people in our own country. I think we are a global economy, but I think it's a disgrace that right outside the Capitol there are people who are homeless, and people actually have to walk by them every day in order to get to their offices, and yet we make decisions that keep them homeless and keep them oppressed, really, in our own country. And so I think we're going to make a big issue about the campaigns. At the same time, we're going to hold those that are sitting in the seats accountable. I think we've gotten a lot of play out of it. We've actually had some people call us, and there are a couple of people, in fact, people who are actually worried about what are we going to say about this, because they want to know ahead of time. I think in 2006, and John really has been around longer than I have here in Washington on the political scene, but what we saw was the Catholic vote is very important to people who are in politics. And there was some movement in that vote in the 2006 election. And so I think the idea that we represent Catholic organizations is going to give us a seat at some tables that we don't really want to be at, and tables, that we do want to be at. And we have to take advantage of that opportunity on behalf of the people.
Building off that, I think the swing votes in this coming election are not soccer moms or security moms or NASCAR dads. They might be uncomfortable Catholics and disappointed evangelicals. That where neither party has shown, frankly, much interest. They don't talk about the unborn child. They don't talk about poor children. The president's vision of compassionate conservatism was attractive to me because I sort of fit that in some ways. But my experience was the conservatism trumped the compassion almost every time. All the focus went towards the war and the tax cuts, not the things I agree with the president on. And the Democrats, with some exceptions, and John Edwards, I think, is that exception, have simply lost their voice on this. I mean, there is a group of pollsters and pundits and focus groups, consultants, that have told the Democrats that talking about the poor is a loser. And to my great dismay, they said, okay. I thought that's what that party was about. And they seem to have lost their voice, if not their soul. So I think we have a chance to work on a bipartisan basis. It has to be that way. We're a big church. I figure anybody who talks about the Catholic vote doesn't know many Catholics. They certainly don't know my family. And so we have a chance to say to candidates, whether it's in New Hampshire or Iowa, or whether it's in Annapolis, Maryland, that this is important to us, and this really matters. I have a sense that this country, maybe it's the war that we sense we're really in trouble. Maybe it's that we did pass a welfare bill, and people think that folks are working, and the fact that they're working and still living in poverty really bothers us. I think there is a real sense, especially in my experience within the church, to stand up for something real and to put together a concern for human life and a commitment to human dignity. So my hope is, as people pay attention to, quote, the Catholic vote, it won't be, whether they sing in the choir or we're an altar boy. How many times do we hear that John Kerry was an altar boy? That was not the question. The question was, what are they going to stand for? What are they going to do? And frankly, young people at a Catholic university can have an enormous opportunity to be heard, to volunteer, to have a voice. And there are going to be particular places and particular times when candidates are going to say, what is this all about? And I hope the answer will be, it's about human life and it's about human dignity.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank everybody else, and we hope to see you next week.
There's lots of paper up here.
Yeah,